On the night of July 14, 1881, a single gunshot in a dark room supposedly ended the life of America's most infamous outlaw. Sheriff Pat Garrett told a story that would become legend, that he alone confronted and killed Billy the Kid. But what if the official story is wrong? What if the details don't add up? The missing body, the vanished coroner's report, the shifting stories, and the old man who, 70 years later, knew secrets only Billy should have known. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a conspiracy, a cover-up that questions everything we think we know. Was Pat Garrett a hero lawman, or did he fabricate his greatest triumph? Did Billy the Kid die that night, or did he escape, living out his days in secret? We are about to unravel the evidence, expose the inconsistencies, and ask the dangerous question, what really happened to Billy the Kid? But before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel to help support our community. Is it true that Pat Garrett was the one who ended Billy the Kid's life? Have you ever heard a narrative that seemed questionable? Perhaps certain aspects felt inconsistent. The pieces didn't quite fit together. The reasons given appeared overly straightforward, the conclusions a little too neat. The account of Pat Garrett slaying Billy the Kid is one such chronicle, and by the conclusion of this presentation, you'll see why people continue to wonder, did Garrett actually fire the shot, or was it another individual? Let's investigate. On the evening of July 14, 1881, Pat Garrett claimed he gunned down Billy the Kid in the darkness. He stated that Billy entered a bedroom at Fort Sumner, unaware of Garrett's presence, and was killed immediately. It sounds straightforward, doesn't it? However, there is a significant issue. Virtually no element of that night has ever been confirmed. To begin, there were merely two people present, Garrett and a man called Pete Maxwell. And Pete, it turns out, provided very little information, not at the time and not afterwards. Garrett recounted that Billy stepped inside and asked, "¿Quién es?" in Spanish. Garrett, concealed in the shadows, lifted his pistol and fired. In an instant, the most notorious fugitive in the West was deceased. But does that match the character of the Billy the Kid we've come to know? Billy had a reputation for being wary, intelligent, and swift. He had broken out of prison previously. He had evaded traps before. Would he truly enter a darkened chamber without a second thought? Would he fail to sense a threat in his companion's home? And there is another point. Garrett never permitted the community to see the remains. He interred the body hastily. No formal photograph was captured. And the report from the area's coroner? It is lost and has never been located. Garrett insisted it was Billy. Some residents concurred, yet others were less certain. A handful stated the deceased individual bore little resemblance to Billy. Later, we will discuss a person who professed to be Billy. However, even in 1881, the roots of skepticism were already planted. Now, let's examine the motivation. Pat Garrett had only recently secured his position as sheriff. Billy the Kid represented his primary objective. Apprehending or slaying him is what established Garrett's fame. He eventually authored a book on the subject, a publication that contributed significantly to the mythology. However, here is the crucial point. Garrett's account was not consistent. In initial tellings, his report was concise and unambiguous. Later on, specifics began to alter. Conversations were incorporated. The sequence of events was adjusted. Why modify the narrative if it were entirely accurate? Furthermore, we must remember that Garrett's book was actually penned by a writer who held a deep animosity for Billy. It depicted Billy as a straightforward murderer, without nuance. Yet alternative reports describe him as charming, devoted to his friends, and well regarded by many in the area. Not a villainous figure. We should also consider Garrett's own integrity. Not all who knew him viewed him as a champion. Following Billy's death, Garrett found it difficult to be re-elected to public office. He became involved in conflicts over property, experienced commercial setbacks, and faced allegations of underhanded conduct. His own life ended when he was murdered in 1908, struck by a bullet from behind. Some speculate it was an act of retaliation. Others believe it was long overdue justice. So, what if Garrett did not actually kill Billy? A theory suggests he shot another person, perhaps a laborer or a different criminal, and presented the remains as Billy's. What was the reason? Because he required a definitive victory. He needed that chapter to be closed. If Billy had eluded him once more, Garrett's standing would have been destroyed. Therefore, he may have ensured the myth was terminated even if the actual man survived. Another odd detail: Garrett did not appear triumphant after the incident. He departed from his career in law enforcement not long afterwards. He never captured another significant fugitive. It was as if his purpose was fulfilled, as if he was aware of an irreversible action. Have you ever taken a step you believed would bring you honor, only to find it complicated everything? Perhaps that was Garrett's experience. Maybe he interred more than just a physical body that evening. In the subsequent decades, whispers persistently emerged. Reports placed Billy in Texas, in Mexico, and as far away as New York. Individuals professed to have met him. Mysterious correspondence surfaced. Individuals even emerged publicly identifying themselves as the Outlaw. Garrett never addressed these assertions. Perhaps he was certain they were fraudulent, or perhaps he was anxious they might be authentic. What choice would you have made in his situation? Adhere to the facts and face potential disgrace, or fabricate a tale to secure your legacy? It is a difficult dilemma, but the past has a peculiar habit of revealing its secrets. As we examine the events today, fresh uncertainties continue to emerge. Without a corpse, without photographic evidence, without credible individuals who were present, the factual reality is difficult to establish. Even modern genetic analysis cannot provide clarity, a point we will elaborate on later. However, one fact remains evident. Garrett's version of events is inconsistent. This naturally directs us toward the subsequent enigma. If Garrett did not kill Billy, then who was responsible? Or did the event even occur? In our next segment, we will delve into a startling declaration that Billy evaded death and continued living incognito for many years. Please stay with us. The person who asserted he was Billy, the Brushy Bill Roberts story. Suppose the entire history you understood concerning Billy the Kid was incorrect. Imagine the famous criminal did not perish in 1881. What if he survived into old age and sought to restore his reputation? This is precisely what one individual professed. His name was Brushy Bill Roberts. Why would an elderly man make such a claim? Perhaps he desired notoriety. Maybe he was mentally unsound. But Brushy Bill did not merely speak. He possessed physical marks. He knew intimate particulars. He recounted narratives that should only have been known by Billy himself. He spoke of the Lincoln County War, of Sheriff Brady's killing, of his own escape from custody in 1881. He depicted individuals and locations with such precision that some were immediately persuaded. Others were derisive. But Brushy Bill was not finished. He had a single objective. He sought an official pardon. Years earlier, in 1879, the governor of New Mexico had offered Billy an agreement: provide testimony against associates, and he would receive freedom. But the pardon was never granted. Billy had honored his commitment. The government did not. And now, in the final years of his life, Brushy Bill stated he desired rectification. His attorney, William Morrison, treated the claim with gravity. Morrison was not a gullible man. He had extensive experience working with former soldiers and their pension applications. As he commenced his interviews with Brushy Bill, he became a believer. So they formally petitioned for a full pardon. This application ignited a frenzy in the press. Newspapers were ablaze with the story. Experts in history vehemently disagreed. The governor of New Mexico at the time, Thomas Mabry, consented to a personal meeting with Brushy Bill. Have you ever yearned for something so intensely that you would gamble everything to attain it? That was Brushy Bill on the day he entered the governor's chambers in 1950. He was dressed in formal attire, complete with a cowboy hat. He brought papers, showed his scars, and told his stories. However, the encounter was unsuccessful. The room was crowded with journalists. Camera bulbs illuminated the space. The governor subjected him to a rigorous interrogation. Brushy Bill faltered in his replies, paused, and could not recall certain facts. Confronted with intense scrutiny, his account wavered. Merely a few weeks afterward, he passed away from a cardiac arrest. Some believed the immense strain was the cause. So, was his account credible? We should examine the evidence. To begin, he was aware of details from Billy's history that were not widely known in 1950. Information concealed within aged correspondence and legal documents, particulars only an individual intimately familiar with Billy would be aware of. Furthermore, his physical scars corresponded. One was located on his torso, another on his back, precisely as historical accounts described the young outlaw. However, this is where the situation becomes peculiar. Photographs were analyzed side by side. One was a portrait of Billy the Kid. Another was of Brushy Bill. Some analysts concluded they were a match. Specialists in facial recognition supported the similarity. Others dismissed the possibility entirely. They argued the kid was only 21 at his recorded death. Brushy Bill was in his 90s. Human features transform over a lifetime. We will detail later why genetic testing could not resolve the debate. For the moment, understand that proof both supporting and refuting Brushy Bill's claim continued to accumulate. The community of historians divided into two factions, those who accepted his story and those who rejected it. Proponents highlighted the discrepancies in Garrett's official report. They observed that Garrett prevented a proper public viewing of the remains, that no post-mortem photograph was ever captured. Their central question was, if you had genuinely slain Billy, why conceal the proof? Skeptics argued that Brushy Bill was merely an elderly man seeking recognition. They claimed his recollections were unreliable, that his narrative blended established facts with imaginative fiction, and that the sheer passage of time made verification impossible. But let's consider the perspective. If you were Billy and you had managed to survive the 1881 incident, what would your course of action be? Would you boast about it, or would you vanish? Perhaps you would retreat to Texas, lead a discreet existence, and await an opportunity to restore your reputation. This is the very scenario Brushy Bill professed to have lived. He stated he adopted new aliases, relocated frequently, and avoided drawing attention to himself. Some residents of Hico reported that he had alluded to his real identity for many years, that he would occasionally mention obscure references to past gunfights, comrades he had lost, and agreements that were never honored. It is simple to dismiss such tales as folklore. However, the average elderly gentleman does not possess gunshot wounds and an intimate knowledge of historical legal proceedings. Brushy Bill was different, and here is an astonishing fact. The town of Hico, Texas, continues to celebrate his legacy. A museum dedicated to Billy the Kid operates on its primary street. The community there is convinced he was truthful. Visitors travel there annually to examine the images, review the paperwork, and form their own conclusions. How would you have reacted in the governor's chamber? Would you have spoken with conviction, shared your history, and demanded fairness? Or would you have remained quiet, allowing the historical record to remain incorrect? The life of Brushy Bill forces us to confront these queries. He never received his official pardon. He never found closure. Yet he bequeathed a conundrum that continues to confound us. So, was he truly Billy the Kid, or merely a gentleman entangled in his own recollections? We may never possess a definitive answer. But in our next segment, we will examine the single piece of evidence that could have resolved the debate. Billy's final resting place. What is its location, and does it even contain his remains? Don't go away. Absent remains. The enigma of Billy the Kid's grave. Where is Billy the Kid actually interred? It seems like a straightforward inquiry, correct? Yet more than a century later, a definitive answer remains elusive. This very uncertainty has sparked debates, legal disputes, and global headlines. Interested in the reason? Keep watching. The accepted narrative states that Billy was buried at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. He was supposedly killed by Pat Garrett on July 14, 1881, and interred the following day. His final resting place was situated beside two of his companions, Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Boder. All three were members of Billy's faction. But here is the complication. That burial site? It remained unidentified for decades. No stone, no indication, merely soil and oral history. And if the spot was never properly identified, how can we be certain who is actually buried there? In 1882, a wooden sign was erected, but it was only wood. It quickly succumbed to the elements and souvenir hunters. By 1904, it had completely disappeared. This is when the genuine confusion started. Then the disaster occurred. In 1904, a devastating flood struck Fort Sumner. The burial ground was submerged. Graves were disturbed. Some caskets were carried away. Markers were lost. Skeletal remains were scattered. It wasn't only Billy's grave that was affected. Many plots were lost or their occupants misidentified. Have you ever encountered antique family portraits with no identification written on the reverse? Imagine attempting to determine identities a full century later. This is the task historians face with these actual graves. Later, a marble headstone was installed. It was inscribed with Billy the Kid pals and listed all three names. But no one could confirm the precise location of the bodies. It was an estimation. And for numerous people, this was insufficient. Travelers arrived from all over. The gravesite became a significant attraction, but with notoriety came vandalism. The headstone was stolen on two occasions, first in 1950 and again in 1981. It was retrieved both times, yet each recovery introduced more questions than it resolved. Let's pose the crucial question. What if Billy is not even buried there? What if the genuine Billy got away, as Brushy Bill Roberts insisted? Or what if Garrett shot another individual and never revealed the truth? The 1990s introduced further peculiarities. Officials from Lincoln County started requesting genetic analysis. They aimed to conclusively demonstrate that the remains in Fort Sumner were Billy's. But what was the outcome? They were unable to locate the body. The reason? Because after that flood, no one could state with certainty where he was originally laid to rest. Some contend he is buried several feet to the left of the marker. Others believe he is not in that location at all. It is a search for hidden treasure without any guide. And without physical remains, genetic analysis is impossible. We will delve deeper into the complications with DNA later, but for now, understand this. Locating Billy's bones is like trying to grasp at fog. And to make the situation even more complex, a second gravesite exists in Hamilton, Texas. Recall Brushy Bill Roberts? He is interred there, and some are petitioning for his exhumation as well. The concept is straightforward. Analyze both. Determine the identities. However, here is the major obstacle. The state of New Mexico has consistently denied requests to excavate. Officials argue it would desecrate the location. They state there is no judicial basis for opening the burial plot, that the potential for a definitive outcome is too low to justify the action. Therefore, the enigma remains interred. Quite literally. Can you envision the scenario if an excavation were to occur and the grave was empty or contained the wrong person? What implications would that have for the mythology of Billy the Kid? For Garrett's legacy? For every historical text composed on the topic? Some suggest this is the precise reason authorities prohibit digging, because the actual facts could be too inconvenient or too astounding. Financial considerations also play a role. Fort Sumner generates revenue from tourists visiting that gravesite. Relocating it, analyzing it, or potentially disproving its authenticity could harm the local economy. And indeed, this is a factor in the discussion. So, to summarize the situation, we possess a gravesite with no verified occupant, a headstone that was stolen on two separate occasions, a burial ground devastated by a flood, and a municipal government that refuses to permit scientific examination. If this were a fictional narrative, you might consider it too implausible. But this is historical reality, and it remains an open case. All because, in 1881, no one took proper measures to identify a burial plot, and because the historical record is frequently shaped by the victors. What decision would you make if you held the authority to authorize the test? Would you approve the dig? Would you hazard dismantling a cornerstone of American folklore? Or would you allow the past to rest undisturbed? This is the quandary confronting New Mexico today. The puzzle of Billy's absent skeleton endures as one of the Old West's most captivating unresolved tales. In our next segment, we will probe further into this conundrum. Why are researchers unable to simply obtain a DNA sample and confirm the identity? And what is preventing them from making the attempt? The explanations may astonish you. New Mexico's genetic quandary. The genetic stalemate. The obstacles to testing. Billy's remains. Given our ability to analyze ancient mummies and resolve decades-old criminal investigations, why can't we definitively establish if Billy the Kid rests in the Fort Sumner grave? It appears it should be a straightforward process. Retrieve a DNA sample, conduct the analysis, and provide a final answer. However, the reality is far more complicated. It is an immensely challenging task. Let's examine the reasons. In the 1990s, a provocative proposal gained traction in New Mexico. Why not exhume the Fort Sumner burial site, obtain genetic material, and conclusively verify the identity of the occupant? It seems like a logical step, yet the initiative immediately encountered significant obstacles. The first issue is the problem of location. As previously discussed, the grave may not contain Billy's body at all. The 1904 flood displaced markers and disturbed remains. The precise location of Billy's body, or its very presence, is unknown. Would you authorize disinterring a plot without certainty about who is inside? This is the initial ethical and practical hurdle. Without a confirmed set of remains, any genetic testing becomes scientifically irrelevant. However, let's assume the correct bones could be located. What follows is the second major complication, the chain of custody. In contemporary legal frameworks, physical evidence must be meticulously documented and secured. But these remains have been interred for over a century. They have been subjected to water damage, potentially commingled with other bones, and might even have been moved. The risk of contamination is extremely high. Then there is the legal opposition. In 2003, Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan, alongside a former judge, vigorously campaigned to reopen the grave. Their goal was to solve the historical mystery permanently. But they faced strong resistance from the state. The New Mexico Attorney General's office blocked the exhumation request. Their justification? There was no compelling legal basis. There was no active crime to investigate and no living family member petitioning for it. They contended that approving such a request would establish a hazardous precedent, allowing historical graves to be disturbed based solely on speculative theories. Have you ever attempted to prove a point only to be informed the effort isn't justified? This was the situation these advocates confronted. The bureaucratic obstacles were insurmountable. Public opinion was also divided. Some local residents supported the idea. Others were vehemently opposed. The Fort Sumner gravesite is a source of tourist revenue. Visitors travel there specifically to see it. If DNA evidence revealed the person buried, there was not Billy, that financial incentive could vanish. This economic factor is indeed part of the ongoing debate. So, to recap the situation, we have a gravesite with an unverified occupant, a headstone that has been stolen on 2 occasions, a cemetery that was ravaged by a flood, and a state government that refuses to permit any scientific examination. If this were a fictional plot, one might dismiss it as too contrived. But this is historical fact, and it remains unresolved, all because in 1881 no one ensured the grave was properly identified, and because the historical narrative is often controlled by those with the most to gain. What would you do if you held the authority to authorize the test? Would you proceed with the excavation? Would you risk dismantling a foundational piece of national folklore? Or would you let the past remain undisturbed? This is the precise dilemma facing New Mexico today. The enigma of Billy's missing bones endures as one of the American West's most enduring unsolved mysteries. The initial obstacle is pinpointing the correct site. As previously established, the burial plot may not contain Billy's body. The devastating flood of 1904 erased grave markers and displaced remains. The exact location of Billy's body, or whether it is even present, is a complete unknown. Would you authorize an exhumation without confidence in the identity of the occupant? This is the primary ethical and practical quandary. Without a verified set of remains, any genetic analysis would be pointless. However, for the sake of argument, let's assume the correct skeletal remains could be identified. This introduces the next significant hurdle: the chain of evidence. In a modern legal context, forensic proof must be meticulously documented and its integrity guaranteed. But these bones have been buried for over 100 years. They have been saturated by water, potentially mixed with other remains, and may have even been relocated. The possibility of contamination is extremely high. Furthermore, there are substantial legal barriers. In 2003, Lincoln County Sheriff Tom Sullivan, supported by a retired judge, mounted a serious campaign to reopen the investigation. They were determined to resolve the enigma permanently. However, they encountered formidable resistance from the state government. Who was Billy the Kid, really? Was he a ruthless murderer, or merely a young man shaped by a lawless era? Was he viewed as a champion by some and a monster by others? To fully grasp the debate surrounding his death, we must first understand his origins. Let's journey back to the beginning. Billy the Kid entered the world as Henry McCarty, most likely in New York City around 1859. Some mistakenly identify him as William H. Bonney, but that was an alias he adopted later in life. Historical documents from that period are notoriously unreliable, but it is known that his father disappeared early on. His mother, Catherine, relocated him and his brother, Joe, westward in search of opportunity. They settled briefly in Kansas before moving on to New Mexico. Tragedy, however, struck swiftly. Catherine succumbed to tuberculosis when Billy was only 14. Can you imagine being forced to fend for yourself as a child? That was Billy's existence. He was homeless, penniless, and without guidance. He soon resorted to minor theft, primarily to secure food. His first arrest occurred at age 16 for filching clothing from a laundromat. Instantly, he was labeled a criminal. He was offered no redemption, no guidance, and began a rapid descent into outlaw life. Billy's early actions were not inherently violent, but the brutal environment he inhabited quickly molded him. By 1877, he had committed his first homicide, shooting a blacksmith named Frank Windy Cahill in Arizona. Accounts indicate Cahill had been physically harassing Billy, throwing him to the ground and refusing to relent. In response, Billy drew a revolver and shot him in the abdomen. Cahill died the following day. At just 17, Billy was now a fugitive. He escaped back to New Mexico and fell in with a band of cattle rustlers. They pilfered livestock, altered brand marks, and evaded law enforcement across the vast open territory. This was the authentic Wild West. The rule of law was fragile, gunfights were commonplace, and personal allegiance was paramount. Have you ever faced a choice between being the prey or becoming the predator? That was the reality of Billy's world. But it was the Lincoln County War that truly cemented his notoriety, a period where folklore and violence collided. In 1878, two powerful factions warred for economic control of Lincoln County. One was supported by the local sheriff and established businessmen, the other by independent ranchers and smaller merchants. Billy found himself squarely in the conflict. He joined the Regulators, a posse formed to avenge the murder of a rancher named John Tunstall. Tunstall had given Billy a job and a chance at an honest life. When rivals ambushed and killed Tunstall, Billy sought retribution. The Regulators ignited a full-scale war. The conflict was characterized by ambushes, gun battles, and targeted killings. The most renowned engagement was the 5-day battle in Lincoln, where Billy and his comrades were besieged in a building surrounded by lawmen and mercenaries. He managed a daring escape under heavy gunfire. Some accounts claim he was disguised in women's clothing, while others insist he simply walked through the cordon. Whenever capture seemed inevitable, Billy always vanished. His reputation was built on a dual legacy, a captivating personality and a talent for evasion. He was an expert rider, a swift marksman, and he carried out his deeds with a disarming grin. There were even those he victimized who admitted they found him likable. Some described him as courteous. Others recalled a youthful, almost boyish laugh. By the time he was 20, he was credited with a minimum of 4 killings. Some estimates placed the number as high as 9. Yet each violent act was framed by context, a perceived danger, an act of treachery, or a desperate struggle for self-preservation. Was he inherently ruthless, or simply more proficient with a weapon than his adversaries? This set the stage for his final act, his capture in 1880. Pat Garrett, once a companion, had become the local sheriff. After a prolonged manhunt, he finally apprehended Billy, who was imprisoned in Lincoln and sentenced to death by hanging. But Billy's story was not over. In a stunning display of audacity in April 1881, he executed one of the most famous jailbreaks in the nation's history. While being moved in the courthouse, he managed to free a hand from his irons, seized a guard's firearm, and killed him. He then shot a second deputy as he fled the building. Locating a horse, he offered onlookers a confident smile before riding away. Can you envision the moment? A 21-year-old fugitive galloping from the heart of his own imprisonment, acknowledging townsfolk while a price hung over his head? The press was enthralled. The public couldn't get enough. Billy the Kid had been transformed into a myth. Yet merely 3 months later, Pat Garrett allegedly cornered and shot him in a darkened room. There was no day in court, no final confrontation, no last statement, just the report of a pistol in the night. So what was the source of his enduring fame? He was far from the only outlaw of his time. Others committed more robberies, more murders. But Billy possessed a unique quality. He was youthful, handsome, and had a memorable moniker. He also became an icon. For some, he symbolized resistance against a corrupt establishment and powerful economic interests. For others, he was a dangerous murderer who needed to be eliminated. His legend intensified after his reported death. Sensationalist novels depicted him as a dashing rebel. Journalists dubbed him the Boy Bandit. Even Pat Garrett contributed to the mythology, publishing an account of the man he purportedly killed. In later years, films would reinterpret him as everything from a noble cowboy to a sympathetic youth. He grew larger than life, an inescapable cultural figure. But behind the sensational stories was a simple truth. Billy was just a boy who lost his mother, faced relentless hardship, and retaliated with the only tools at his disposal: swiftness, intelligence, and a revolver. Have you ever considered how you would endure if you were completely alone from the age of 14? Billy didn't have the privilege of such a hypothetical. His reality was to flee, to combat, and to outmaneuver the adults who sought his death. His life spanned a mere 21 years. Yet the impression he left was more profound than that of many who lived far longer. This is the reason his name persists. Therefore, when we question whether he truly died that night or lived on, we are probing more than a historical detail. We are exploring what we choose to believe about myth-making, about the will to live, and about the hope for redemption. Perhaps this is why the story of Billy the Kid continues to resonate, because a part of us deep down roots for the young man to make his getaway.